I'll get kicked off of the Facebook feed. Okay, it looks like we are live on all platforms. So thanks, folks, for joining us today for our second speaker for Afghan Advocacy Week. My name is Veronica Leisure. I'm the Civil Rights Director here at CARE Oklahoma, and I'm very pleased to be welcoming our guest from Human Rights First. Emily, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much, Veronica, for having me. So my name is Emily Cutright, and I work on the Veterans for American Ideals team at Human Rights First. And so we are a grassroots network of thousands of veterans across the country that uphold and uplift and promote human rights at home and abroad. And so for this past year, our main focus has been all about Afghanistan and helping evacuate those that need to be evacuated.
Thanks so much. We've been following very closely your work on the Afghan Adjustment Act and the Evacuate Our Allies campaign. Can you tell folks a little bit more about that campaign?
Yeah, totally. So really, throughout 2017, 2018, 2019, there was a core group of, I would say, about 3 organizations that worked consistently on SIV issues. And an SIV is an immigration program that grants permanent residence to those people who aided our U.S. government abroad. Mainly, we see this through translators and interpreters of our U.S. military. And so this core group of 3 people really, kind of met every other week for a few years, pushing Congress to increase those number of visas. And then April 2020 happened, or 2021 happened, excuse me, where President Biden announced the withdrawal from Afghanistan and that our troops would be leaving the country by August 31st. And so very, very quickly, we started to collaborate with immigration experts and veteran groups and human rights organizations and Afghan American-led organizations, resettlement agencies, faith coalitions, national security leaders, really to create a coalition that advocated for both the resettlement of Afghans who have arrived in the United States and the continued evacuations of those who were left behind. So right now we have about 200 organizations involved with the Evacuate Our Allies campaign. We have different working groups that work on legislative actions and communications and legal representation, unaccompanied children, administration advocacy. And so we've really been working in coalition for the past couple of months to advocate for a mass evacuation, which we started to do in April as soon as Biden announced the withdrawal. We created a plan for a mass evacuation that we collaborated with members of Congress with. We have met with various government entities, including DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, the NSC, the National Security Council, various members of Congress. We hosted a rally in front of the White House on July 1st with Congressman Seth Moulton to pressure Biden to do an evacuation. And then August happened, which kind of segues to where our coalition stands now. So currently, right now, about 77,000 Afghans have arrived in the United States. This includes those SIVs, special immigrant visas that I talked about earlier, as well as their family members, as well as those who would qualify for refugee status. So women, human rights defenders, LGBTQ individuals. And because of the chaotic evacuation and what we saw happen in August, these 77,000 Afghans arrived under something that's called humanitarian parole. And had they arrived as refugees, which they would have, had we not gone about the withdrawal the way that we had, after a year, they would get a green card. Had they come in with that SIV, that special immigrant visa, they would have automatically come in with a green card. But parolees don't have this option. And so that's why we in our coalition are proposing an adjustment act where their status would be adjusted and corrected so that they could stay in the United States and allow lawful permanent residence.
Thanks for that background information. We know that the history of how our Afghan neighbors got here is one that's really complex. We know that they have experienced unimaginable levels of struggle and trauma to become our neighbors. And so for those of us who've been working very hard to help them resettle here in Oklahoma, it's really important that we follow through on those promises and continue to push for them to be able to build those safe and healthy lives here. And adjustment acts are not new, right? There has been a history of the United States welcoming refugees from international conflicts. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you made, Veronica, because like you said, we've done this in the past. This is not new. We've passed similar legislation at the conclusion of several US involved conflicts in the past. I think three really noteworthy ones are after Fidel Castro's rise in Cuba, after our withdrawal from Vietnam and the fall of Saigon, and following our US military actions in Iraq. And after these conflicts, we passed legislation, adjustment acts that granted these Cubans, people from Southeast Asia, and Iraqis who entered the US as non-immigrants or parolees to adjust to that permanent resident status. I think some really important points in these historical examples are, the Cuban Adjustment Act. Since the passage of the Cuban Adjustment Act, over 1.2 million Cubans have obtained LPR status in the US. We continuously permit Cubans to adjust to status. In fact, this most recent decade, we saw the highest number of Cubans successfully adjust to LPR status. Same thing with the post-Vietnam and the post-Saigon example. What was really interesting about the Vietnam after that was the adjustment was addressed in multiple pieces of legislation so that over 130,000 refugees could be admitted through parole. So after the fall of Saigon, there was a Refugee Act of 1975 that gave funding of over 400 million dedicated to the resettlement of Vietnamese, Cambodian, Laotian refugees. There was a second bill passed 2 years later that provided an expedited pathway to this adjustment. And I think that under that second one, I believe over 38,000 more refugees obtained status. And then finally in 2000, they passed another adjustment act, which allowed even more Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian migrants to adjust to LPR status. And I think that this just goes to show you that this is not a problem that was over on August 31st. We have a long and successful history of creating these expedited pathways to citizenship for those who assisted us. And we really need to. I mean, we kind of look at what's happening right now in Afghanistan, all of those Afghans who were left behind, who didn't make it on the planes to the United States. And, I think it goes to show you, and especially all of these historical precedents go to show us, is that this can assist Afghans for years and years to come. We know that the war in Afghanistan and the conflict in Afghanistan didn't start, last year. It didn't start, when we announced the withdrawal. And so this could be a really humanitarian program that could assist, hundreds of thousands of Afghans to come.
And that would be amazing if we could see the same movement. So Oklahoma has benefited tremendously from these adjustment acts. Oklahoma City has a very robust and vibrant Vietnamese community that stayed in Oklahoma City and built up what's now the Asian district. And so this is a part of Oklahoma where you can go and you can visit shop at Asian-owned grocery stores, Vietnamese grocery stores. You can have some of the best Vietnamese food in this part of the country. And then you could go to a Vietnamese optometrist. Then you could go visit a Vietnamese real estate agent. And then you can go get your insurance adjusted by a Vietnamese insurance agent. You could spend an entire day in this district visiting with Vietnamese members of our community who stayed here, who were able to build businesses, start families, and really develop this community that drives so much local economy. And hopefully, we really hope that could be extended to our Afghan friends, that they would be able to do the same thing and build up these lives and build up a local economy and a local community that serves the rest of the Oklahoma City community in such positive ways. Now, what happens if we don't get an Afghan Adjustment Act? What does that mean for our Afghan friends?
Yeah. So, the effects are detrimental and honestly really upsetting. The alternative would be forcing them to fend for themselves in an already burdened and backlog asylum system. Right now the asylum backlog is 400,000 cases, and our immigration backlog as a whole is over 1.4 million cases. So all of our new Afghan neighbors, which, like you just mentioned, Veronica, make our communities stronger. They make our communities better. Frankly, they would be, put in these exasperated backlogs and delays, and really would just be left with a huge amount of uncertainty for their future. I had a colleague describe this as our immigration system as a maze, but worse than a maze because there's absolutely no exit. And the most upsetting thing is, for all intents and purposes, these are refugees. They should be allowed refugee status. The only reason why they're not being treated as refugees is because our administration, frankly, just paroled them in instead of admitted them as refugees. So really, if we don't pass an Adjustment Act and if we don't give them legal permanent resident status, Afghans paroled in the US could lose their jobs. They could be deported back to Afghanistan while their applications are still pending, which is definitely not what the United States as a whole, and is not what Oklahoma wants to see.
Yeah, the thought of having to kind of uproot a family and relocate to a new place and try to rebuild a life, and then face the threat of having to be deported back to the country that you fled, is just a really unimaginable level of trauma to add on top of what our friends have already experienced. So we created a local toolkit modeled off of some of the other materials that organizations like Human Rights First have created that teach Oklahomans how to advocate at the federal government for an Afghan Adjustment Act, how to contact your congresspeople and your senators, how to call them, what to say. We have scripts if you don't feel comfortable just talking about it. And we'll have a guest speaker later on this week who will give us a little bit more of an insight into what federal advocacy really looks like and how to really maximize those minutes that you get with our federal delegates. And last night we heard some really great thoughts from a local veteran who shared his experiences working with refugees, working with Afghans who aided the U.S. military and other coalition forces. And so we're hoping that this week of Afghan advocacy will really encourage people to continue the work that we started in September when we welcomed our first Afghan families to Oklahoma, and encourage Congress to do the right thing to evacuate the remaining Afghans who are still in danger, and to smooth the pathway to permanent residency for the ones who are here. So thanks very much for joining me, Emily. I really appreciate the history of the coalition and the history of these adjustment acts. I think our audience will find that really helpful as we continue into Advocacy Week, and we'll be watching what happens on Friday very carefully.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Veronica.
You're very welcome. And for those of you who are watching, please stay tuned for more Advocacy Week materials that will be coming tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday as we watch that budget vote on Friday. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you later.